everybody, welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm the Campaign Marketing Manager here at eLearning Brothers. Well, not here at eLearning Brothers. I'm working from home, just like most Americans. Today's session is going to be about how to set yourself up for success in Lectora Online. This session is being recorded, and we will get a copy of it sent out to everybody who is registered, so you can watch that at your leisure afterwards and revisit some things that you may want to revisit. If you have questions during the webinar, we'll be ready to answer your questions in the questions panel, so please do use that, and we'll get to as many of your questions and comments as we can. All right, so to talk to us about Lectora Online, we have Bill Milstid, our senior developer for our products team, with us today. Thanks, Bill, for taking some time from out there in Florida, and I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you and pass the screen to you.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, I assume you guys can all see my screen at this point.
Looks good.
So, all right. So today, as noted, we're going to be covering some tips and tricks in Lectora Online. Specifically, a lot of these do relate directly to Lectora Desktop as well, but they're really geared just toward Lectora Online today. So there are going to be a few things in here that might be slightly different, but minimally so. So you should be able to apply everything that we're looking at today, if you're not an online user, to your other your desktop application. A little heads up, if you are checking out the webcam, I'm probably going to be looking over to the side a lot. I got notes today. Usually I try to memorize these, or at least have a little bit firmer in my head what's going on. But obviously, we got a bit of a shake-up today, so I'm going to be relying on notes. If I'm looking away, I apologize. Please bear with me. Okay, so I'm just going to hop straight into it and start covering stuff. Hopefully we can get through everything, and if we do get through everything and have some time to spare, we will take some questions. I'm sure also along the way there may be a few questions. Just let Andrew know, and I will stop and address them and see if we can get everything answered for you by the end of our session. Okay, so first thing that we're going to cover today is just a general tool overview of Lectora. That's first thing we're going to do. Now, Lectora is an interesting tool as compared to some of the other development tools that are out there. It has kind of a logical setup in the way that it works, as opposed to being timeline based like Storyline and to a certain extent Captivate. Lectora is really more object based. And so to understand how things work in Lectora, you need to have a good understanding first and foremost of how the title explorer works, okay? It's organized like a book, right? And the book itself is separated into several different components. The book is the title or your actual course. That's, if you notice up in this title explorer area over here, that's the topmost element that we've got that contains every single other element below it, all your actual content, right, go on those elements inside the book. And if you notice, it's even got a nice little nifty book icon to the left of it to help you remember which it is, or which type of element it is. Again, so that holds all of the information on a particular subject. It also contains a couple of other different types of organizational units, potentially. Those are chapters, sections, and pages, okay? And really those are just ways, aside from the page, chapters and sections are really just ways to, again, organize your content. So back to the title, right? So we said that it holds all this stuff. It holds the chapter, the section, the page. Those pages we're gonna get into at the end. They're what most people are familiar with in Lectora because they hold the content. But the cool thing to know about the title is there's one really important thing with regards to some of the stuff we're going to talk about downstream in this session, is that it can include objects that are not chapters, sections, or pages, that are actually just objects. And those will persist title-wide, right? So throughout your entire course. Here's what I mean by that. So if you look over, if I just close all the stuff that's inside this title and the title explorer here, and I look at what I've actually got going on. I've got a few objects up at the top here. I've got this navigation, a back and a next button in it. That's what this right here. I've got these theme elements, and inside that theme element group, I've got a little header background. I've got a logo, a little page title, text, placeholder. And then I've got this live area thing that I'll show you when we're out of the run mode here and we're actually into the working mode of the tool, or edit mode of the tool. Those are all elements that would exist on every single page in my course, right? So I'm gonna always have this header and branding stuff up here. I'm always gonna have this navigation element down at the bottom. And so those can actually, those objects that need to persist title-wide can actually live at the title level. So it does go beyond just holding the organizational units for your course. It can also hold objects and allow them to kind of inherit throughout the course. Inheritance is something we're going to talk about specifically as we go. All right, so chapters in a book. If you look at the way I've got this course that we're moving through right now organized, you can see my chapters. These are the green kind of books right here, right? We got a tool overview, build and best practices, and accessibility. Those are the kind of the main sections or main, well, chapters that we're going to be covering in this session. They contain the logical, Lectora defines it as containing the logical major subdivisions of information about the subject, right? Big chunks. Those get further subdivided into sections, which we're going to talk about in a second. And it can include chapter-wide features that persist just throughout that chapter, similar to how we talked about with the title, okay? Sections are the minor subdivisions of information about a topic. So in my tool overview here, I've got two subsections or two sections. We've got a general overview and tool settings. And then inside of each one of those, I have some content pages. Similarly, in my build best practices, I've got 3 different sections here: streamline, mobile focus, and pre-flight. Okay, just another way to further break down and organize your course to make it a little more logical as you're developing and to a certain extent presenting. And again, sections can also include features that need to persist within that section, right? So they inherit within that section. Finally, pages, which is kind of the smallest unit of division in a Lectora course. That's where we actually get the content for our course, right? So when you're looking through a Lectora course and you've got content page like this one that we're looking at here, or perhaps another, presentation content page like this one here, those live on pages. Pages house all of the objects that actually make up that content. So all your buttons, all your text, all your interactive elements, etc., that are specific to a topic, right? Those live on a page. And that's kind of the basic overview of how Lectora is structured from the Title Explorer. It's important to understand that largely in terms of that inheritance idea that I was thinking about. This is something we're going to spend some time on a little later on in our streamline section over here. So we've got a little page over here that's just based on inheritance. That notion becomes increasingly important when you want to cut down on your development time and cut down on the number of assets or number of objects that you're trying to include in a course. So it is important that you understand this organization so that you can make use of that feature to make your development life a lot easier. Frankly, that's the main reason I want to show it to you. Okay, so the meat of this presentation is really going to be beyond this. We're going to get into some tool settings right now that allow you again to kind of maximize your efficiency. And then after this, once we go over these kind of up front, here's how you set up your file, here's how you understand how your file works, kind of stuff. Then we're going to get into actual best practices for building, and then hopefully we're going to talk a teensy bit about 508 accessibility stuff. Okay. All right. So the first thing that I want to talk to you folks about is hotkeys. Okay, so this is kind of a critical one for me, because one of the challenges that I sometimes have with online authoring tools is that a lot of the times the built-in shortcuts that I rely on don't make their way over to online authoring tools or versions of a tool that may be more remote. Well, sometimes the editability or ability to set preferences for those types of things that help me work more quickly while I'm developing a course, right? Keyboard commands rather than having to move my mouse up and click and find and do. Sometimes you can't customize those in online suites, but you can in Lectora, which is actually pretty great. So we're gonna talk about that right now. There are a number of built-in shortcuts for really the majority of things that you might actually do in Lectora. And there are two ways that you can access those. So I'm going to show you those now. We're going to hop into the edit mode of this course, and I'm going to show you that. So one, like I said, there's a lot that's already built in, a lot of keyboard shortcuts that are already built into the tool. And in order to find out what those are, if you don't already know what they are, all you have to do is actually hover over an object, and Lectora will let you know. So for instance, if I wanted to very quickly, without having to move my mouse up and grab the add text object insert command here, or the button here, all I really need to do if I'm on a PC is Control-Alt-0, and I believe that is Command-Alt-0, or about that? Yeah, no, that's still Control-Alt-0 on a Mac. Either way. Similarly, if you wanted to put in different media types, audio, video, or say a button, they all have kind of individual preset keyboard commands, hotkeys, however you want to call them, set up for you in Lectora. All you got to do is hover and find out. Alternatively, let's say you don't like those, or there's an action that you might want to take that doesn't happen to have a keyboard shortcut. Well, you can set those or edit those. The way that you do that is actually by going into the Preferences pane. Hit File, Preferences in Lectora, and they have a little tab here called Hotkeys. Okay, so you can see that right when you get here, you got a series of shortcuts that are set up. Right, new. You highlight that one that's in here. You can see what the actual hotkey is. Open. You can see what the hotkey is for that. But for instance, import a Lectora Online package does not happen to have a hotkey. And that's something that I do a lot, so I might want to set that hotkey up. And the way that I might do that is actually by just clicking into this Press New Shortcut Key field and then putting in the hotkeys that I want. In my case, I'm on a Mac, so that was Command-I for import. And then once you're done with that, you press Assign. Now it looks like there's not a whole lot of hotkeys or preferences in here. You're correct. That's because Lectora chooses to actually organize those for you into several different categories. So if there's something you're looking for that doesn't immediately pop up in that categories drop down right when you get into the preferences, click the drop down and move through the sections, and you can see what all has been assigned and what all is available to be assigned. All right, so most of the edits happen to have a keyboard shortcut already assigned. Let's say you wanted to change that to Alt-Command-Shift-P. That's all you got to do. Hit Assign, and that will set that up for Style Painter Paste. Similarly, we've got a lot of options here in our Insert dropdown, as well as Layouts and Tools. Effectively, basically anything you actually need to do in Lectora that you find yourself doing often, you can set up here, or just go confirm what it would be. Now, if you're in the tool a lot, this may become increasingly important. If you're not in the tool a lot, well, that's okay. You can probably just stick with what they have predefined. And in that case, again, all you need to do is hover over to find out what that is. So the next section that we're going to talk about here is actually the rest of the preferences. There are a few additional preferences that are in there that we probably should talk about. In that same dialogue that I was in, and I'll bounce back to that at the end of this little spiel here, there are three more. There's more than three, but there's three critical preferences in there that you can also set that are great for saving yourself a bunch of time. And in fact, some headache in certainly one of these cases, the organizational settings piece that we'll get to at the end. So publish strings, autosave, and organization settings are the three that we're going to address. First one, publish strings. What this is actually the standard text that gets used at runtime, okay? So as we know, Lectora automates a lot of out text. So for instance, right here, right? Test results test result text that precedes a user's answer. I've set that up in my case as survey says, but that probably should be, the answer is something like that. You can go through in the Publish Strings tab and basically set pretty much all, well, not pretty much, entirely, all of the runtime text that Lectora displays during the actual user interaction of the course, a live course, and with whatever you want. And there are a couple instances of why you may want to do this. The first one I would suggest might be for branding or audience-specific language that you might want to have in your course. Right. So back to this first example that I had edited in my version. The test results text that precedes the user's answer, that may need to be whatever that's going to be, right? Whatever by default it is. But in my case, ELB, we're a little bit more kind of a fun brand. We take things a little more lightly than some folks. So, survey says works for me. That fits our brand. I'm going to go ahead and do the rest for these to kind of adjust the language and the verbiage in a way that better reflects who we are as a company or how our course is set up, or even sometimes who the audience is, right? Perhaps you got a more formal audience, you want to go a little more formal in here, or just leave it as is. If you got a more informal audience, you may want to adjust and make it a little more informal. And you can save those edited publish strings to a specific file. So if you need, you can export that and save it so that you have a series of different published strings that you can change between different courses, right? Let's say you've got a medical course that you're setting up in Lectora. You may have one way to phrase this, and another you may have a different. More commonly, though, this would probably get used for something like translation, right? So, not only when you're translating a large custom course, not only do you have to worry about the content text that's on screen, but you do have to worry about all the labels and publish strings that are system generated for things like quiz questions, etc. You do that here. And so the way that I would handle this is I would actually, if I was going to set up a translated version of a course, I would employ that method I mentioned just a second ago, where you can use different string sets. I would edit these strings to be the language that I needed, and then save out that set as a, let's say, Spanish set of strings. That way, every time I was running a translation, we could select that Spanish string set and publish directly in the appropriate language without necessarily overwriting my English my string set, right? I could just flop back and forth between the two. Now, the reason it's important that we can add, import, export these string sets is because this setting is consistent and it stays across all courses. So even though it's in the file preferences pane, it will pop up often in other areas as far as I'm aware. Let's double check that so that I make sure I'm not giving you totally wrong information. Survey says, there we go, and this is in a different course. So making use of that ability to save different sets can allow you to customize without losing the defaults or losing what work you've done, perhaps in a different course. Okay. All right. So the other one that I want to talk about, other than publish strings, is autosave. This is an important one for online courses or online development, right? I'm having a lot of trouble with bandwidth right now. It's understandable. We got a lot of people working from home, certainly in my area. I know we've got a lot of professional knowledge workers around here that are now homebound, and they are hitting that internet. I've been having some connectivity issues, and luckily, I'm not losing any work during those times because I have Lectora set up for autosave. It may not necessarily be for you. So I would suggest that you check this before you start your work or before you start working in Lectora Online in general, and just make sure that autosave is checked on if that's something you desire. And you can set your save interval here as well. So not only can you turn it on or off, but you can set the interval for the save. 1 minute might be a little much. 5 minutes seems about right for me. But you know, if you're a gambler, maybe you could set that up to every 20 minutes or so, and let Lectora do the work for you. I'm in the habit of using kind of a combination of the autosave and the hotkey. I do a Command S or a Control S about every change I make anyway, but I do like to have this autosave turned on. In the past, I have had it off, and I have lost some work just due to my connectivity issues. Okay, so then the next thing that I want to show you here is it's a little bit outside that same preferences pane, but it is a type of preference that you can adjust, and that is the organization settings that you have for your Lectora Online account. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that we're going to scroll right past when I open up the organization settings pane, because really I'm mostly concerned about just one element down toward the bottom of the pane. It's for fonts. If you've ever worked in Lectora Online, you know that there is a fairly small list of universal web-safe fonts included in Lectora Online for course development. And the reason for that small list is because there really only is a small list of universal web-safe fonts that exists. Different machines, different browsers, all that other stuff. Everybody has different fonts on their machines, on their different devices. Lectora handles this the right way and keeps the fonts that we know are going to work everywhere as the default list. But you can add to that. You can adjust that and use custom fonts. This course that we're looking at right now, the slide presentation that we're looking at right now, which is built in Lectora Online, obviously, it uses custom fonts. And it does that in a couple ways. The standard way that folks who are used to working in Lectora Desktop may recognize is that we include a font tag, right? And that basically just goes out and links to where the font actually resides. In this case, it's Roboto, and that's hosted by Google. But another thing that you can do in Lectora Online is actually set up the tool so that your drop-down can display those, so that it's not just limited to those web-safe fonts like Arial or Century Gothic or Trebuchet or whatever, but it also does include that Roboto font or Roboto condensed, which is what we're using here, or let's say Fira Sans, which is another Google custom font, right? And the way that you do that is actually you have to be in your main page here, your kind of main dashboard. And you go into your organization settings. And when that organization settings loads, you scroll on down to your bottom, and next to the last here, we have an entry called user fonts. All you have to do there is actually enter the fonts that you want to appear in this little field right here, and hit save once you've done so, and magically they will appear in your course. There is a specific format to that, though, and I've got it right here underneath the organization settings block. If you notice, we've got a bracket, and then we've got an open quote, a single quote, and then we have display name here, and then we've got a closed single quote, a comma, and then the name of the font on Google. So in this case, it's Fira, and then we close out that quote for any group that or for any font set that we're trying to use. Notice the same pattern here for Roboto and Roboto condensed. And then whenever you're done, you close that off by a bracket. Without that formatting, it will not work. So you do have to be particular about it, but there is great help out there on the Lectora, both user forums and on the actual help desk itself. Between those three preferences and a general kind of understanding about how to really organize, or at least how organization works in Lectora, you can really streamline the courses that you build and save yourself a fair bit of time just there. Okay, but we're going to go ahead and hop in to look, and we're going to look at a few more things, basically just to make your development again go more quickly, and also we're going to try to clarify how certain aspects of development works in Lectora based on some questions about certain things that we've seen in our files and that our users have asked us in the past, okay? So this section is the streamline section, how to streamline your development and make it a little more smooth as you go. The first topic of that is inheritance. I made reference to this several times at the beginning when I was talking about the organization. I mentioned that objects can persist at the title, chapter, and section level. So we're gonna look at inheritance now. We're gonna really discuss it from the title level, and talk about how that works for speeding things up for you and then making things less clunky as you're developing in Lectora. Okay, this is one of the most useful tools in the Lectora Online toolbox, in my opinion. Again, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but any items that we place at the title level, like this nav item up here, will automatically be included in all pages in my title. So right, if we're looking back through what we've gone through so far, got a title explorer, got a nav element. We've also got this header stuff going on that exists up here in the theme elements, right? If I turn that off, you can see. Those are placed and inherited throughout the course. Again, particularly useful for things like that, global theme elements like headers and footers and branding and things like that. But inheritance can go well beyond that, and that's why I'm kind of harping on it, because a lot of the time we think of it just for these global unchangeable elements, but in fact we can execute some actions on inherited objects and do some pretty nifty stuff, and use that to really cut down on the number of elements that we may have to include in a given title. Okay. So, for instance, let's look at it no, we're going to skip that. Now, the cool thing about inheritance is that it is not fixed. Okay. So you don't have to necessarily inherit everything. For instance, on this page, in my inheritance page, if I didn't want my navigation to appear, or I didn't want my theme elements up top to appear, I can change that. I can change it pretty dramatically. I can turn off everything. I can turn off just specific items. And I do that by going up to the properties pane here, and then selecting the inherit tab, and then choosing from one of the options that you're given. By default, again, inherit all objects from the parent is going to be what we see. Inherit no objects from the parent is going to automatically take everything from that title level and dump it into the excluded box over here. You don't get to edit, you don't get to customize. But if you use the exclude inheritance of certain objects radio there, you can go in and selectively edit what does and does not show up on that individual page. And again, you can also apply that to chapters and sections. So I mentioned I wanted to turn off the theme elements, the header and logo and page title from this file. All I do is I select that object, move it over to the excluded pane, and hit OK. And when I do, that will no longer appear on this page. If I were to go back to the introduction right before it, you notice that does appear. And if I go to the next page after that, it stays inherited. So this is kind of a level by level inheritance, all right? And that, once we start talking about things like change contents and variables, as we're going to move into those next, we can start to combine actions or combine features in Lectora to get some pretty neat options to again reduce what we need. As an aside, this is not, I'll just kind of talk about this, hopefully I don't confuse too many people with it, but one of the things, for instance, that we use inheritance for in combination with the next thing we're going to talk about, change contents, is often we may use background graphics in the course. Pretty normal thing to do. We will actually sometimes place those background graphics that even may change on a page-by-page basis back up at the title level. Even though they change, inheritance background image may be different than the change contents background image. We'll place them at the title level and we'll either play with inheritance or this next thing we're going to talk about, change contents, to be able to affect those on a page-by-page basis without having to include duplicate objects on different pages. Okay, so enough inheritance. I think I've probably beaten that one into the ground with how important I think that one is. So we're going to move on next to the thing I've been kind of talking about in conjunction with it here, and we're going to talk about change contents. Okay, I've kind of talked around this one a few times, so we're going to actually address what this really means now. Change contents is actually a built-in action that Lectora gives you that is probably second to inheritance as far as I'm concerned, with niftiness and importance in the Lectora toolbox. Okay, it's a very, very simple action, but if you use it well and you kind of think about it critically, it can be a really, really powerful tool. So we're going to look at an example that we right now actually. So we got this change contents button. Okay, right here underneath it, we've got some text that says click that tab to change this content. Well, if I click the change contents tab, all of a sudden this content here changes. That's pretty useful in a lot of ways. This is actually how we build a large number of our click to reveal files. So I'm going to move forward and show you guys one of our actual click to reveals in just a moment. It's kind of, we're going to build off of where we're at here to get to there. But the method that we use to actually have a tab that then shows different content wherever that may reside is that. It's a very, very simple change contents action. You can target whatever content block you'd like, and it's all you got to do is you go over your actions pane here, you select the object that you want to assign that change contents action to in terms of the clickable object or whatever object the action is going to act upon. Maybe it's when that object appears, right? Things like that. And you add a change contents action. So once you add your action, all you do is you click here and you navigate down to change contents. You'll immediately be given 3 little customizable fields. Your target is what is going to change, right? So we know what's going to cause the change is this change contents button. But what it's actually going to act on is this target here. And I'm going to change this contents object. So it's labeled here in the title Explorer as contents. When I do that, I want to set the text that's in this content box, but you could also just replace it with a variable if you wanted. And we're going to talk about variables next, so I'm not really going to get into these quite yet. If you choose to set the text like I've done, you also have this drop-down pane here, or it's a text entry field rather, that you can type your content into. So I've just decided, I basically just copied and pasted my content from another section, dumped it in here, pressed OK, and now every time I click this button, click that tab to change this content is going to turn into whatever I have in this text field. Okay, that text field will go away if you choose to set this to just a variable, right? Because there's really nothing for you to edit there. Now, there's more to change contents though, because not only can you change contents just to text, right? You can also change the contents of an image. And that's kind of what I was hinting at previously about using a combination of inheritance and this nifty little action that I'm getting into now for background images. Okay? It works exactly the same way as it does with the change text on a text box, only you just assign it to an image. So for instance, and I'll run this in a second and show you, but all I've done is I brought an image in from my library, placed it on screen, and then I added an action to it. Set that action to change contents. The target for that action is this object, and the resource, because this is an image, your option changes from the text or variable options that you had previously, and it becomes a resource field. So you can choose either from what is in your course already in your library, or you can browse for the file and go find something. Now, here's how that works. I've set that action to be on click. So now when I click that image, it's going to change into whatever I've told it to change into. Okay. Again, useful for perhaps click-through reveals or changing, maybe even dramatically changing states of an object once they've been clicked or messed with by a user. That's a technical term there, messed with. There's a lot that you can do with it. It kind of gets tricky to try to talk around what all you can do with it because there's a lot of flexibility there. As we go forward into our project here and we look at this action groups page that I'm going to get to after variables, you'll see how all this kind of comes together with change contents and variables and using media and text in the change content action. So we'll get there if you can hang on a little tighter. So now, variables. When we're talking about the change contents action, I had mentioned earlier that it can potentially be used in conjunction with other things like that inherit button that we have there, or the inherit option. It can also be used in conjunction with variables. That can actually be pretty useful if you have predefined text or predefined elements in custom variables. It can speed things along pretty substantially in your course. But variables can be used outside of the change contents element as well. They can be used inline in text, either to insert something you've got predefined or to insert a system variable. And you can use that to really follow a user through the course or really, do any number of things. I mention it because a number of users have questions in the past about whether or not you can use variables inline in text, and you can. All you have to do in Lectora is just enter, as I have it here, var, parentheses, and then whatever your variable name is, and then close parentheses, wherever you'd like that variable to appear, and you're good to go. Okay. So you can create custom variables in Lectora to track any number of things in a course, custom actions or by your user, progress, etc. But there are also a large number of built-in system variables that Lectora, or reserved variables as they call them, that Lectora gives you access to. I've got a screenshot, or I got a link on screen that actually goes directly out to the full list of Lectora reserved variables. But I've also got a few here on screen. Okay, so a couple of them that we use pretty regularly, or certainly do in the more custom side of things. We don't use a ton of it on the product side when we're developing templates. But here are some of those, right? So yeah, current chapter name, which actually just lists the chapter of the page or the chapter that you're currently on. Current date, right? So that's today's date, and it's in a specific format. Current page name, and that is something we use in every template we build. I'll show you in just one second. Current view, right? That is the actual name of the device and orientation that's currently being used to view a title: desktop, phone portrait, phone landscape, all those. That actually can be really useful for conditional actions, and it's a quick way to kind of ensure that certain behaviors or certain functions in a given interaction may or may not, perform based on what a user is actually using. We don't touch that one a ton in the template development, but that has been pretty great for us in custom. Page in title. Now that's actually the current page number relative to the entire title, and then pages in title is the total number of pages in the title. You can see right there those two variables automatically, dumped into a text string. That's kind of a breadcrumb, right? You can get a progress indicator with just using two built-in reserved variables that Lectora already provides you. And then AICC student name, which is the username or he username, depending on whether or not I put a typo in my course, as it gets reported by the AICC or SCORM LMS. Okay. So practically, kind of how that works. I've got up here this page title text, right? So what I instead want to do, I want that to automatically update. So I'm going to change that right here. I'm going to go up into my page auto title text, and I'm going to type in, I broke something. There it goes. I'm going to put in, I just came over pre-formatted, I'm going to put in the current page name for my course here. And then I'm going to move through and see what happens. Right, so if I go onto my Title Explorer page, that automatically updates. Hotkeys, right, where I had my placeholder for my page title text, that now automatically updates to whatever the name of this page was here. Same for preferences, right? We got introduction, we got inheritance, change. Oh, all of a sudden I've got to change contents a little different. The reason for that is if you look here, I've got a little action that I've set up that's actually showing you how to change the contents on that page title text as well as these elements on the page. But as I move back into variables, you'll see that that kind of goes back to what we would expect, which is just that placeholder for the for that page name there. So we include that in every course that we build. Little sneak peek, I'm building one right now in Lectora Online for a course starter that we have coming out. You'll notice I've got that current page name variable sitting pretty prominently in all of the pages that are actually being built currently. Okay. That's one nice thing, is it just saves you, right? You're already going through and titling your pages appropriately. That saves you one more step, one additional thing you don't have to key in while you're building out these courses. All right, so the last thing in this chapter, or actually the last thing in this section, I'm sorry, is action groups. All right. So we talked about streamlining your build to minimize objects, kind of, I've hinted at it, right? And I talked about using variables in line, right, with page titles and things like that. But a lot of the times, even though like you can inherit objects and you can change contents and you can run variables to get these, you know, to minimize the number of elements you have in your course, a lot of the times you end up with a situation where you still have a lot of actions that you take in an interaction, even though kind of the name of the game in Lectora Online is to try to minimize as much as possible and save yourself touch points. Very frequently, you end up with a ton of actions on a given object. I'm going to show you how to cut down on some of that and centralize those so we can, again, streamline and minimize the number of things that you got to do. You do that by running action groups. So let's look at this 4-tab click through. I'm going to go ahead and run it, and then I'll explain to you what's going on. On this, we've got 4 tabs to the left. On the right, we've got some content here. As I click each tab, we're going to pop a video, and we're going to pop some content here. And then that video and that content is going to change every time I click one of these other buttons. All right. If I were to build that out kind of in a standard method, right? Really, I would have a bunch of duplicate actions on all these buttons, because all we're doing is clicking each button and having content and media show. Basically, what it takes to do that is each one of these buttons needs to have a stack of actions that tells Lectora, each time I click this thing, show my page content, right? Hide my intro content, and change my button state from this button 1 to this button selected state. Okay? And then set these buttons to be their normal state or visited, perhaps, if they have been visited. In the past, we might have developed this in a pretty heavy manner, where each one of these individual buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4, got its own different content group, where let's say content 1 launched page content 1, content 2 button launched a separate page content 02 object or group, right, of different content objects. Same thing for 3 and same thing for 4. So if you look at my Title Explorer here, you'll notice that I only have 1 page content element, as opposed to kind of what I'm hinting at, which normally this would be, it would take like 4 of those to build out for each of these tabs. What we're doing is we're actually using a combination of things to streamline that. So this kind of goes back to that change contents bit that I was talking about earlier. Instead of doing that, we just have our button launch one page content action, or page content group rather, and change the material that's in it. And since it's all kind of doing similar stuff along the way, we also have grouped our actions. I'll show you what I mean exactly. So when each one of these buttons fires, the first thing it needs to do is hide all 4 buttons, hide this page content element, and hide this off-screen close button, which is there for mobile view. Each one of those buttons does that no matter what. And then after that, then we get into some button-specific stuff, and sometimes we also kind of get into some additional shared content actions, but we'll get into those in a bit. Rather than taking those duplicate actions and putting them on each one of our buttons individually, we just take them up and we pull them at the page level and we group them in action groups, so that you can basically just group those consistent actions into one little chunk and tell in one action on the button level your button to run that action group, rather than having to put each one of those in line. Now, in this particular case, because we have 2 different button states basically for each button, that's saving us a lot of effort. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 actions across 8 different buttons. So that's 48 different actions that we don't have to manually key in. That also means that if I've ever got an error on one of these buttons, let's say when I click a button, this page content is not hiding the way I want it to, I don't necessarily have to go hunt and peck and find out, is this on my button 1 action where the problem is, or my button 1 visited action? I know it's in my action group that does that particular function. Action groups, figuring out a way to take your common actions, pull them off of the object, move them up to the page level, and group them up is a very important tool in Lectora, and a pretty critical way to speed up your development time and streamline your file, make it a lot nicer. All right, so we're going to look at breakpoints here. Okay. By default, there are 5 breakpoints in Lectora. But what does that mean? Well, okay, so in the simplest sense, breakpoints are basically just the dimensions where a browser will render a different version of the course. Lectora handles this by device view. So tablet landscape, phone landscape, tablet portrait, phone portrait, and then of course desktop, right? The cool thing about that is that in each of these views, you can rearrange, you can remove, you can change content to render best for the user on that device. So if you notice, I'm actually using a combination of the things we've talked about kind of previously here. I'm just resetting everything based on what our view is. Okay. With images, it's pretty nice and simple. All you got to do is actually go into an image while you're in a breakpoint. You select it, and when you move to your next view, you can go up and you can change what the actual source is for that. But this is particularly useful to make sure, again, that you have the best content displayed the best possible way for your learner's device. Okay. Now, one of the places where this gets pretty useful is in background graphics and images, like I talked about kind of previously at the inherited level. You can create different backgrounds, just like I've done with different images here, for each of your device views. Okay. So if you notice, the dimensions are specific, right, to the device. Sometimes they're a little taller and a little skinnier, right? You expect that. Your devices are different sizes. That means you're going to have different backgrounds for your different device views, or at least have to reposition them. Lectora gives you the option, again, to come in with any of these objects and change what the source is, change what the actual content, well, to a certain extent is, if you're using variables or change actions, things like that, based on what the user is looking at. You can take things off screen to minimize the clutter. You can add things on screen to kind of maximize organization and clarity for your user. And with that, Lectora also gives you a number of options for object positioning, and those become increasingly important in mobile development. Okay, so Lectora, again, I was saying that it allows you to kind of move and change objects based on what view you're in. In addition to that, they give you some settings with your objects to allow you to tie your positions to the outer dimensions of a given title, and that can help save you time when repositioning elements on those device views. Okay, so the ones we're going to look at right now are offset from right and offset from bottom, and then we're going to get into anchor position as well. Offset from right, by default, an object is offset from top left in Lectora. That means that you've got this standard position element here. Its x coordinate is 34, y coordinate is 117. Whenever I move to different device views, right, it's going to generally retain that kind of same position relative to the top left corner. But sometimes, as your device gets wider or smaller, you may actually want elements, maybe navigation, for instance, down here, to be tied to the right-hand side of the screen. In order to do that, all you have to do is position an element where you want and select this offset from right button. Now it factors in the entire width of the object. So for instance, this thing is 400. This thing is 400 wide, so we've got it set to a 327 y coordinate. Or I'm sorry, a 435 x coordinate. That's basically the 400 width plus 35 pixels of padding to the right. Same thing with bottom. Navigation especially is pretty frequently tied to the bottom of a course or of a page. In order to get that to happen, all you got to do is go into your position and size settings and offset from bottom. In our navigation, we do that offset from right and offset from bottom. The third option that it gives you is to anchor your position. Okay. Now, anchoring position basically makes that object's position relative to the kind of the current viewport and the offset settings. All right. We use this a lot for pop-ups on mobile, which helps us kind of reduce scrolling up and down the page to review content or navigate back to buttons. That's also pretty useful for headers, right? So let's say that we wanted these theme elements to always stay in position no matter where I was scrolling, so they would overlap content as I scrolled past it. You would do that by tying this object or setting this object to be anchored in position. I'll show you exactly what I mean by that by just running this real quick. So in desktop view, all right, I click this element and it is set to be anchored at a specific y coordinate. So when I click in desktop view, it pops up, and as I scroll, you'll notice it stays where it is and it begins to overlap that button. Same thing with tablet portrait, right? Notice it stays in position and moves up and down. And if I come back in here and rerun it so you can see it cleanly in phone portrait, you'll kind of see how this actually plays in the different views, right? So it's significantly higher in this position, and as I scroll up and down, it stays as intended. And that's just based on where I had it positioned in those different device views. So there's a lot of flexibility with how you can position, offset, and anchor objects in Lectora to help you with your mobile development. All right, we're running out of time here, it looks like, but I'm going to try to get into one last thing, and that is error checking. All right, error checking is pretty great in Lectora. By default, Lectora does an automatic error check when you publish. So if I were to go over to the home key and press publish, it's gonna, once it warms up and gets a feel for what's going on in the file, process everything, it's gonna throw me a list of errors or warnings that pertain to my file. So I've got some unresolved destinations and my actions. That's because of my navigation elements here. But I've also got this like unused XAPI statement. So I can click on this, and when I do, it'll take me right to where that action is, or where that warning is. And if I so choose, I can go in and resolve it. Now, in this case, that was just a warning and not an error. So I would have been able to publish over that and ignore it, and it would have been no problem. But if it was an error, Lectora would prevent you from publishing, and you can double click that red error and bounce to the problem in the course and fix it. Okay. Now that's great. I really like that it provides that at publish. But I actually really like to run that error check ahead of time. While I'm developing, especially if I'm in a big custom course, much bigger than this one, I will run the error check quite a lot, and it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily publishing a lot. If you go over the tools here, there's an accessibility check and an error check. Accessibility check checks 508. We're not going to have time to address that today, but the error check does basically exactly what the publish error check did, exactly the same thing, but while you're working. And that gives you the opportunity to go in ahead of publish. Again, that's important in a big course, and get your errors corrected before you go and kind of waste that time and click your button and publish. That can be kind of frustrating, especially as courses get really large. That publish time can start to lag if you have a lot of error checking that you're doing. So I personally like to run it here, minimize the errors, and then I also like to go back in into my my course and set up my publish settings. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I just did the wrong thing. To minimize the number of errors that come through. By default, Lectora will show warnings for resource sizes and unused resources and variables. I turn those off, and I run only the errors and warnings when I'm publishing, and then I try to make sure that those are handled before I ever get to publish. And between kind of those two practices of minimizing errors at publish and then double checking that I've got them all straight before I go to publish, I can cut down on my publish time, the actual time it takes to package this file, sometimes pretty significantly. So that tiny little workflow thing is often pretty important for me. Okay, we technically have one additional section, but it looks like we're at 158. So I want to just stop and check in with Andrew here and see how we're doing and see if we have any questions or.
Yeah, do you think this last section could you could tell it with screenshots in the blog afterwards? I think that might be useful.
I think it's a great idea. Yeah, especially 508 stuff. It's pretty tricky, and I'm not going to get super detailed into this, just because 508 is kind of its own. It's its own. We could have webinar upon webinar about how to handle 508 in general, but then also in Lectora. I'll write a quick and easy blog post, and we can get that up later. No problem.
All right, sounds good. Then let me take the screen back from you then, just for a second here. Let's see, change presenter back to me, and we're going to show this screen. All right, great. Thank you, Bill. This is great, and we are going to look forward to getting that other information from you for our blog later in the week. We've got this 7-day free trial that you guys can grab, and it's got tons of Lectora templates in there as well. And if you didn't get our email earlier in the day, or yesterday, I believe it sent out, we're also offering just a free set of templates to try to help you get your stuff converted over, your ILT converted over into online training. So if you need help with that, send us an email as well. We're happy to hook you up with that. But thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks Bill for joining us. And this has been super useful, and we hope that everybody got what they needed out of it, and we'll see you guys next time.